My name is Emma Montgomery. I am 32 years old, and for the past quarter-century, my mother has meticulously crafted a narrative that I am a broken woman, a liability, and a soul too complicated to ever be truly loved. Standing here in the center of the Arizona Biltmore's Grand Ballroom, under the suffocating glow of three-tiered Swarovski crystal chandeliers that cost more than a suburban starter home, I can feel the weight of 25 years of her psychological warfare pressing against my ribs. The air in this room is thick with the scent of $500 an ounce Roja parfums and the metallic, cold tang of the $1,200 custom ice sculpture carved into the shape of the Montgomery family crest that is slowly weeping onto a bed of imported orchids. Senator Montgomery, do you think Arizona voters deserve to know their senator is married to a narcotics addict? The reporter's voice cuts through the ambient noise like a serrated blade, vibrating with the kind of practiced moral outrage that only comes from a pre-packaged lead. My mother, Sylvia Montgomery, stands exactly 10 feet away by the bar, her hand wrapped around the stem of a crystal flute filled with $140 Veuve Clicquot, and as she swirls the pale gold liquid, a predatory, satisfied smile dances across her lips, a smile that tells me she is the one who fed the wolves. I am a pediatric neurosurgeon at Phoenix Children's Hospital, a woman who spends 16 hours a day navigating the microscopic margins of the human brain. Yet in my mother's eyes, I have never been more than a tool or a stain to be bleached out of the family tapestry. Last night, in a desperate, scorched earth maneuver to regain control over the daughter who dared to marry for love instead of political leverage, Sylvia leaked a forged medical file to the tabloid press, a document that falsely claims I have spent the last 3 years in and out of clandestine rehabilitation facilities for an opioid addiction that doesn't exist. She calculated that the scandal would be the final blow to my husband Julian's career, assuming that a 36-year-old rising star in the United States Senate would choose his seat on the Armed Services Committee over a disgraced wife who was publicly hemorrhaging his poll numbers. She expected him to fold, to issue a cold, typed statement from his chief of staff, and to hand me the divorce papers she had already drafted in her mahogany-paneled study in Paradise Valley. But Sylvia Montgomery, despite her decades of social engineering and her mastery of the Phoenix elite, has made the one fatal mistake that people of her ilk always make. She mistook Julian's silence for weakness and his devotion to me for a vulnerability she could exploit. The ballroom is a sea of tailored navy wool and silk crêpe de chine, filled with 400 of the state's most influential donors who are currently frozen in a state of delighted horror as the cameras swivel toward my husband. Julian stands beside me, his hand resting firmly on the small of my back, and I can feel the heat radiating through the fabric of my $4,000 midnight blue velvet gown by Oscar de la Renta. He is wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit from Brioni. His cufflinks are vintage 1950s Cartier gold, and his expression is as unreadable as a granite cliffside during a monsoon. I look at Sylvia, who is now pretending to look shocked, her hand fluttering to the 3-carat diamond pendant at her throat as if she is deeply pained by the accusation being hurled at her daughter. She is 62 years old, a woman whose face has been frozen into a mask of regal indifference by $40,000 worth of high-end plastic surgery and the best Botox money can buy in Scottsdale. She thinks she has won because she knows I cannot prove a negative in the middle of a campaign gala, and she believes the sheer noise of the accusation will drown out the truth of my life. I remember the way she looked at me when I was 7, sitting in the back of her 1998 silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class, telling me that my grades were the only thing about me that didn't disappoint her, and that if I didn't learn to hide my emotions, the world would eat me alive just like my father did. My father, a man who fled to a villa in Tuscany with a 24-year-old yoga instructor the moment the divorce papers were finalized, leaving me behind with a woman who viewed motherhood as a corporate rebranding exercise. Sylvia spent my entire adolescence telling me I was unstable, gaslighting me every time I questioned her cruelty, and making sure that every achievement I had, from my valedictorian speech to my medical degree from Johns Hopkins, was framed as something I achieved in spite of my supposed mental fragility. When I met Julian at a fundraiser for the Arizona Community Foundation, she tried to veto the relationship within 3 weeks, realizing that she couldn't manipulate a man who had grown up in the foster care system and fought his way into the Senate through sheer, unadulterated will. The silence in the Biltmore ballroom stretches, becoming heavy and suffocating, and I watch the way the light glints off the reporter's digital recorder, a small black device that is currently recording the potential death of a political dynasty. I can see the exact moment Julian decides to strike, his eyes narrowing slightly as he shifts his weight forward, moving with the predatory grace of a man who spent his youth working construction in the 110-degree heat before he ever touched a law book. He doesn't look at the reporter and he doesn't look at the cameras. Instead, his gaze locks onto Sylvia, who is now taking a dainty sip of her champagne, her eyes gleaming with a triumph she hasn't quite earned yet. My mother doesn't realize that Julian didn't just spend the last 24 hours calling lawyers or damage control specialists. He spent them in a windowless office in D.C. with 2 private investigators who specialize in the kind of forensic accounting that makes billionaires lose sleep. He knows about the $400,000 embezzlement from the Montgomery Family Foundation that Sylvia used to cover her gambling debts at the Wynn in Las Vegas 3 years ago. And he knows about the non-disclosure agreements she forced the kitchen staff at the Paradise Valley estate to sign after she threw a heavy crystal decanter at a maid's head during a martini-fueled rage. Julian isn't going to defend my honor with a simple denial because he understands that in the world of high-stakes politics and old money grudges, the only way to stop a predator is to take their legs out from under them in a public square. I feel his fingers tighten slightly on my waist, a silent signal that the curtain is about to rise on the final act of my mother's reign as the Queen of Arizona society. I think back to the thousands of dollars she spent on my private schooling at Phoenix Country Day School, not because she wanted me to learn, but because she wanted the prestige of the bumper sticker on her car, and how she used to withhold my allowance for weeks if I didn't perform well enough at her dinner parties. Every meal in our house was a performance, every holiday was a photo opportunity, and every vulnerability I showed was logged in her mental ledger to be used against me later. When Julian and I got married at the Royal Palms Resort, she refused to walk down the aisle, sitting in the front row with an expression of such profound distaste that the photographer had to airbrush her face in every single wedding photo just to make the album look celebratory. She hates that I am no longer under her thumb. She hates that my husband looks at me as if I am the most precious thing in the world, and she especially hates that she can no longer use my supposed complexity as a leash to keep me in her shadow. The reporter repeats the question, his voice rising in pitch, sensing that he is about to get the soundbite that will lead the 11 o'clock news on every major network from Tucson to Flagstaff. "Senator, the voters are waiting," the reporter says, shoving a microphone toward Julian's chest, nearly brushing the silk tie that cost $300 at Neiman Marcus. I watch Sylvia's reflection in the ice sculpture, her face distorted by the frozen curves of the Montgomery crest, looking like a gargoyle watching over its prey. She thinks this is the moment Julian distances himself from me, the moment he calculates the cost of my reputation and decides it's too expensive to maintain. But Julian doesn't play defense. He plays for blood. He takes a slow, deliberate step toward the microphone, pulling me with him so that we are a united front, a single silhouette against the bright lights of the media scrum, and for the first time in my life, I don't feel like the complicated girl my mother tried to destroy. I feel like the wife of a man who is about to burn her world to the ground. The air in the ballroom seems to drop 5 degrees, the hum of the air conditioning unit in the ceiling sounding like a low-frequency growl, and I can smell the faint, expensive scent of my mother's perfume wafting toward us, a mixture of tuberose and bitterness. This gala was supposed to be the crowning achievement of the legislative session, a night where $5,000 plates of Wagyu beef and truffle-infused risotto were served to the people who move the levers of power in this state, but instead, it has become a courtroom. I look at the ice sculpture one last time, watching a single drop of water roll down the carved letter M, and I realize that by tomorrow morning, that name will mean something entirely different to the people in this room. My mother thinks she has used the last of her power to bury me, but she hasn't realized that when you bury a daughter who has spent her life learning how to heal the broken parts of the human mind, you are only planting the seeds of your own destruction. Julian clears his throat, the sound echoing through the speakers positioned around the ballroom, and as the room falls into a deathly, expectant silence, I see the first flicker of genuine fear cross Sylvia's face, a hairline fracture in the porcelain mask she has worn for 60 years. She has spent my entire life telling me that I was a burden, a shadow, and a mistake. But tonight, she is going to learn exactly what happens when the daughter she discarded finally finds her voice, and when the man she underestimated decides that the time for mercy has passed. This is not just a political scandal or a family dispute. This is the public execution of a reputation built on 25 years of lies. And as Julian opens his mouth to speak, I know that the Montgomery name is about to be scorched clean by the truth. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where your name is protected and your soul is nurtured. But for me, family was a cage made of expensive labels and sharp-edged expectations that I am finally, violently, breaking out of tonight. The contrast between my life and my sister Chloe's was never an accident of fate. It was a meticulously engineered financial apartheid, calculated down to the very last cent by a mother who treats affection like a high-yield investment. Chloe is 30 years old, a professional socialite who lives in a $4.2 million estate in Arcadia, nestled right under the shadow of Camelot Mountain, where the air feels thinner and more expensive. Her home is a sprawling masterpiece of white stucco and floor-to-ceiling glass, featuring a zero-edge infinity pool that costs $800 a month just to heat, and a kitchen where the Sub-Zero refrigerator is stocked with nothing but $30 cold-pressed juices and alkaline water. She moves through her world with the unshakable confidence of someone who has a zero balance on her American Express Black Card every single month, a feat made possible by a family trust that was legally barricaded against me before I even finished my residency. While Chloe is waking up at 10 in the morning to attend a private one-on-one Pilates session that costs $300 an hour, followed by a maintenance appointment for her preventative Botox that runs her $1,200 a month, I am already 6 hours into an 80-hour work week at a Phoenix nonprofit for foster youth. My daily reality is a 2018 midnight blue Subaru Outback with 84,000 miles on the odometer, a cracked windshield from a stray rock on the I-10, and a back seat permanently cluttered with donated backpacks and folders of legal case files. My salary, which I have to stretch to cover my modest apartment in a part of town where the sirens never quite stop wailing, wouldn't even begin to cover Chloe's monthly habit for $800 Loro Piana cashmere throw pillows or the artisanal candles she buys from a boutique in Old Town Scottsdale that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that settles into your marrow when you spend your afternoons scrubbing the linoleum floors of a youth shelter to keep the health inspectors from shutting you down, knowing that your own sister is currently debating which shade of taupe silk wallpaper would best suit her climate-controlled wine cellar. I remember one Tuesday last month when the shelter's industrial water heater broke, a $6,000 emergency we didn't have the funds for, and I had to spend 4 hours on the phone begging for corporate donations while my hands were still red from the bleach I'd used to clean the communal bathrooms. That same evening, I saw a post on Chloe's Instagram showing her and my mother, Sylvia, laughing over a $2,000 seafood tower at Ocean 44, their skin glowing under the warm restaurant lights, completely insulated from the grit and desperation of the world I inhabit. Sylvia has always viewed me as the family's moral tax, the difficult daughter who chose a path of service as a way to spite her mother's vanity, and she has punished me for it with a surgical financial precision that is breathtaking in its cruelty. When our grandfather passed away, he left a substantial inheritance that was intended to be split equally, but Sylvia, acting as the executor of the estate, used a series of legal loopholes and manufactured stability assessments to ensure that my portion was placed into a restrictive discretionary trust that I can only access in the event of a catastrophic medical emergency. Meanwhile, Chloe was handed a blank check, which she used to purchase a 2024 Land Rover Range Rover autobiography in a custom matte finish that cost $170,000. Every time I see her car parked in our mother's circular driveway during the holidays, the gleaming paint reflecting the perfectly manicured desert landscaping that costs $2,000 a month to maintain, I am reminded that my sister's luxury is built directly upon the wreckage of my disinheritance. Chloe doesn't see the injustice of it. She truly believes she is more deserving because she stayed obedient, because she married a man who works in private equity, and because she never made our mother feel uncomfortable by bringing up the systemic poverty of the children I work with. The financial gap between us is a chasm that defines every interaction we have, a constant reminder that in the Montgomery family, loyalty is purchased and dissent is taxed into oblivion. I remember the Christmas when I asked Sylvia for a small loan to help expand the shelter's literacy program, a mere $10,000, which is what she spends on a single weekend at the San Francisco Fairmont. And she looked at me with a mix of pity and disdain before telling me that I shouldn't have chosen a hobby that I couldn't afford to subsidize myself. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to Chloe and handed her a small blue box containing a vintage Alhambra necklace from Van Cleef & Arpels that retailed for $15,000, praising her for her exquisite taste in jewelry. It is a psychological warfare of the highest order, a way to keep me small and stressed, forcing me to count every dollar while my sister doesn't even have to look at the price tags on her $300 yoga leggings or her $6 organic avocados. My office at the nonprofit is a windowless room with a humming fluorescent light and a desk I salvaged from a government surplus auction for $50. And yet, it is the only place where I feel like I have any real power, even if that power is limited by a budget that is constantly under threat. I spend my days fighting for kids who have been discarded by the system, children who arrive at our door with their entire lives packed into a single black trash bag, while Chloe spends her days in a sun-drenched Arcadia sunroom discussing the merits of different interior designers who charge $500 just for an initial consultation. The sheer audacity of the wealth disparity would be easier to swallow if Chloe were a person of substance, but she is a hollow vessel for our mother's ambitions, a woman who hasn't worked a single day in her life, and whose biggest stressor is whether or not her regular hair colorist at the Waldorf Astoria can squeeze her in for a touch-up before the gala. When I look at my hands, they are dry from the constant use of industrial soap and the desert heat. My nails are short and unpolished because I can't justify spending $60 on a manicure when that money could buy 3 weeks of formula for a runaway teen's infant. Chloe's hands, by contrast, are soft and perfectly groomed, adorned with a 7-carat emerald-cut diamond that catches the light and throws rainbows across her pristine white marble countertops. Sylvia has taught Chloe that her worth is tied to her aesthetic, to her ability to blend into the background of a high-society fundraiser without causing a scene, and she has rewarded that vacuousness with a life of absolute ease. I am the one who remembers the names of the children in the shelter, who stays up until 2 a.m. filling out grant applications for a few $100s of federal funding, and who drives a car that smells faintly of old coffee and desperation. The Subaru's engine has a slight rattle now, a sound that warns me of an impending repair bill I'm not sure I can cover this month, especially after I personally paid for the school supplies of a boy named Marcus who wanted to be a lawyer but couldn't afford a notebook. Every time I turn the key, I feel a pang of resentment, not toward the car, but toward the woman who could fix my life with a flick of her pen, but chooses instead to watch me struggle as a form of character building she never required of her favorite daughter. Chloe is currently planning a trip to the Amalfi Coast that will cost more than my annual salary, including first-class airfare and a private villa in Positano that rents for $4,000 a night, all while I am wondering if I can afford to replace the worn-out tires on my Outback before the monsoon season hits. The injustice isn't just in the money, It's in the way that money is used as a tool to erase me from the family narrative, making me look like a failure because I don't own a Chanel handbag or live in a zip code that starts with 85018. To Sylvia and Chloe, my life is a cautionary tale of what happens when you don't play the game. A narrative they use to justify their own excess while ignoring the fact that their comfort is subsidizing my sister's complete lack of contribution to the world. I am a woman who navigates the complexities of trauma and poverty every day, while my sister navigates the complexities of a wine list at a restaurant where the cheapest bottle is $200. We were raised in the same house, under the same roof, but we live in two entirely different universes, separated by a wall of cash and my mother's cold, calculating heart. As I stand in the shelter's tiny kitchen, holding a mop that has seen better days and looking at the stains on the ceiling that we can't afford to paint over, I realize that the $800 cashmere throw pillows in Chloe's house are more than just home decor. They are monuments to the fact that my sister was chosen and I was discarded. My mother's wealth is a weapon, and she has wielded it with a surgeon's precision to ensure that while Chloe floats through a life of luxury, I am left to drown in the responsibilities she abandoned. The 80-hour weeks, the aging Subaru, the constant financial tightrope. These are not just the marks of my profession, they are the scars of a family war that Chloe doesn't even know we're fighting because she's too busy enjoying the spoils of a victory she never earned. But what they both fail to realize is that while Chloe was being pampered and protected, I was being forged in a fire they couldn't possibly survive, and the strength I've built in this struggle is a currency that no family trust can ever buy. One day, the white stucco walls of that Arcadia estate will feel like a prison, and the zero balance on that Amex card won't be able to pay for the peace of mind that comes from knowing you've actually earned your place in the world, a realization that will hit them far harder than any financial loss ever could. Until then, I will keep scrubbing these floors and driving my rattling Subaru, knowing that my name may be a dirty word in their social circles, but it is a lifeline to the children who have no one else, and that is a wealth that Sylvia and Chloe Montgomery will never, ever understand. The ultimate betrayal did not arrive with a thunderclap or a dramatic confrontation in a darkened room, but rather at exactly 10:14 a.m. on a bright, sterile Sunday morning that smelled of expensive citrus and chemical cleaners. I had walked into Chloe's kitchen, a space that had recently undergone a $350,000 renovation involving slabs of book-matched Calicotta Oro white quartz and a suite of Sub-Zero and Wolf appliances that looked more like industrial art than cooking tools. The morning sun was streaming through the high UV protection floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating every microscopic speck of dust that dared to settle on the pristine surfaces of her 60-inch six-burner range. Chloe was standing by the central island, her movements fluid and unbothered as she used a $45 Williams-Sonoma serrated knife to slice a $6 organic ruby-red grapefruit into mathematically perfect segments. She didn't even look up when I entered, her focus entirely on the fruit, which was resting on a hand-thrown ceramic plate that I knew cost more than the weekly grocery budget for the entire foster youth shelter where I spent my waking hours. As I moved toward the counter to set down a folder of paperwork I had intended to discuss regarding our family's charitable trust, I saw her iPad mini glow with a sudden notification, the screen cutting through the reflected glare of the quartz. It was an open email sitting on the display, a digital confession of a crime I hadn't yet realized was being committed, sent from our mother's private encrypted account to a high-priced media fixer in Washington, D.C., whose retainer fee starts at $50,000. The subject line was written in all capital letters, a blunt instrument of destruction that read, "Final Strike, Emma Records," and in that split second, the air in the room seemed to turn into a vacuum. It was not just a lapse in judgment or a family spat. It was a coordinated political assassination planned with the cold-blooded efficiency of a corporate takeover. I stood there, frozen, as I skimmed the body of the email, which detailed the exact timing for the release of forged medical files that would paint me as a functional narcotics addict who had been siphoning hospital supplies for years. My mother, Sylvia, chose that exact moment to step out of the shadows of the breakfast nook, appearing like a ghost in the machinery of my life, her presence preceded by the suffocating, powdery scent of her $300 Chanel No. 5. She was dressed in a silk loungewear set from Loro Piana that cost $3,000, her posture as rigid and unforgiving as the architecture of the house she had bought for her favorite daughter. She didn't offer a greeting or a smile. Instead, she looked at me with a level of clinical detachment that was more terrifying than any outburst of rage could have been. She crossed the room with a measured stride, her $200 Italian leather slippers making no sound on the white oak floors, and she leaned against the quartz island as if she were about to discuss the weather rather than the destruction of my marriage. She gave me exactly 48 hours to leave Julian, to sign the pre-drafted divorce papers that were currently sitting in a digital vault at her attorney's office, or she would trigger the release of the forged addiction files to every major news outlet in the state. She called me a stain on Julian's $12 million legacy, her voice a low, melodic purr that carried the weight of a death sentence, and she spoke about my husband's career as if it were a fragile piece of porcelain that I was destined to drop and shatter. Sylvia told me that a man of Julian's caliber, a man destined for the highest echelons of American power, could not afford to be anchored to a woman who was too complicated to be loved and too broken to be repaired. She stood there, silhouetted against the bright Arizona morning, her skin glowing from the $3,000 a session laser treatments she receives at a boutique clinic in Scottsdale, and she waited for me to break. She expected the tears, the pleading, the frantic denials that had characterized my childhood interactions with her. But she had forgotten that I spent my days dealing with real trauma, with children who had survived horrors she couldn't even imagine in her air-conditioned life. I didn't cry, and I didn't let my hands shake, despite the fact that my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my clinical white coat, pulled out my smartphone, and took a crystal-clear 12-megapixel photo of the iPad screen, capturing the digital trail of her betrayal before Chloe could even realize what was happening. The click of the camera shutter was the loudest sound in the room, a sharp, mechanical punctuation mark that signaled the end of my mother's leverage. Sylvia's eyes narrowed, the skin around her mouth tightening in a way that revealed her true age despite the expensive fillers, and for a fleeting moment, the mask of the elegant matriarch slipped to reveal the predator underneath. I looked at Chloe, who was still holding the grapefruit knife, her expression one of mild annoyance rather than guilt, as if my presence were nothing more than a minor interruption to her Sunday morning wellness routine. She was a silent partner in this, a woman who would happily watch her sister's life be set on fire if it meant the smoke didn't ruin her imported silk curtains or jeopardize her standing in the trust. I didn't say a word to either of them. I didn't scream about the unfairness of it or remind them of the times I had covered for them or the sacrifices I had made to keep our family's reputation intact while I worked in the trenches of the city's most forgotten neighborhoods. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of that $350,000 kitchen, past the foyer with its $10,000 abstract painting by a local artist whom Sylvia only bought to look philanthropic, and out into the blinding heat of the driveway. As I got into my rattling 2018 Subaru Outback, the contrast between my reality and theirs felt like a physical weight. But for the first time, it didn't make me feel inferior. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, the 84,000-mile engine humming beneath me, and I looked at the photo on my phone, the evidence of a mother willing to commit a felony to ensure her daughter stayed subservient. Sylvia thought she was protecting a legacy, but she was actually documenting its downfall, leaving a digital fingerprint on the very weapon she intended to use against me. She didn't know that Julian and I had spent the previous evening talking about our future, sitting on the porch of our modest home while the desert wind blew through the Palo Verde trees, and that we had already made a pact to never let the Montgomery money dictate our worth. She believed that Julian was a man who could be bought or intimidated by the threat of a scandal, not realizing that he had survived a childhood of actual deprivation and had a moral compass that wasn't calibrated by poll numbers or family standing. I shifted the car into gear, the tires crunching over the expensive crushed granite of Chloe's driveway, and I drove away from the Arcadia estate without looking back in the rearview mirror. The 2-day clock was ticking, a 48-hour window that Sylvia thought would be filled with my surrender, but she had no idea that she had just handed me the keys to her own prison. I spent the drive back to the shelter thinking about the thousands of hours I had spent trying to earn a seat at a table that was built on lies and financed by cruelty, and I felt a sudden, profound sense of relief. The forged addiction files were a fantasy, a paper tiger created by a woman who had run out of legitimate ways to control the world around her, and the 12-megapixel image on my phone was the reality that would eventually dismantle her carefully curated life. I arrived at the nonprofit, the sight of the peeling paint on the front door and the stack of donated boxes on the porch, feeling more like home than any mansion in Paradise Valley ever could. I walked into my windowless office, sat down at my $50 government surplus desk, and began the process of securing that photo in multiple encrypted locations, ensuring that my mother's final strike would be the one that missed its mark and struck her instead. Sylvia Montgomery had spent 32 years telling me I was a liability, a stain, and a complication, but she was about to learn that a woman who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the room. She had underestimated the daughter she tried to bury, and she had definitely underestimated the man that daughter had chosen to marry, a man who didn't play by the rules of the country club or the debutante ball. The silence of the Sunday morning was over, and as the heat of the Arizona sun began to bake the asphalt outside, I knew that the next 48 hours would be the most important of my life, not because I was fighting for my marriage, but because I was finally fighting for the truth. Family is not defined by the names on a trust fund or the blood that flows through your veins. It is defined by the people who don't manufacture lies to destroy you when you finally step into the light. Sylvia and Chloe could have their white quartz and their Sub-Zero appliances and their $300 perfume, but they would never have the one thing that Julian and I possessed, a foundation built on something stronger than money. As I closed my office door and picked up my phone to call my husband, I felt a calm I hadn't known since I was a child, the calm of someone who has finally stopped running and decided to turn around and face the monster. The Montgomery legacy was about to meet its match, and it wasn't going to be a quiet or a clean ending for the woman who thought she could schedule a public execution on a Sunday morning over a $6 organic grapefruit. The clock on my $50 government surplus desk shifted to 1:45 a.m., and the silence of the night was broken only by the relentless Arizona wind rattling the thin metal window frames of my office at the nonprofit. The sound was a hollow, rhythmic scratching, like the ghosts of every disappointment I had ever swallowed trying to claw their way back into the room. I sat there, illuminated by the harsh, flickering hum of a single fluorescent overhead bulb that had been buzzing for 3 hours, casting long, skeletal shadows across the linoleum floor I had scrubbed just a few days prior. Before me lay a simple yellow legal pad, the kind you buy in bulk for $5 at Staples, and on it, I had drawn a stark vertical line down the center with a black ballpoint pen that was running low on ink. I had labeled the left column Family Loyalty and the right column Survival, but as I stared at the page under the clinical glare of the light, the left side remained a vast, aching desert of white space. There was nothing to write there, because loyalty, in the Montgomery lexicon, was a one-way street that ended in a brick wall of my own self-destruction. I realized in that quiet, freezing hour that Sylvia and Chloe didn't see me as a sister or a daughter. To them, I was nothing more than a toxic asset to be liquidated, a line item on a balance sheet that was no longer yielding a high enough social return to justify its maintenance. The weight of that realization should have crushed me, but instead, it acted as a catalyst, stripping away the last vestigial layers of daughterly guilt that had kept me tethered to their whims for 32 years. I stopped feeling like a victim shivering in the cold and started feeling like a forensic auditor walking into a crime scene with a briefcase full of subpoenas. Love, as I had discovered through years of therapy and late-night shifts in the pediatric ward, was a fleeting, treacherous feeling that my mother used as a lure, but revenge, I realized, was a spreadsheet, cold, calculated, and mathematically irrefutable. I looked at the photo on my phone again, the 12-megapixel image of the email that detailed my planned character assassination, and I began to build my own ledger of their sins. I thought about the $400,000 embezzlement from the family foundation, the forged signatures on the trust amendments, and the decades of psychological trauma they had disguised as high society parenting. The air in the office smelled of old coffee grounds and the metallic tang of the desert dust that managed to seep through every crack in the building, a stark contrast to the scent of $300 Chanel No. 5 that permeated my mother's world. I began to write, my pen flying across the paper as I listed the dates, the amounts, and the names of the people who had helped Sylvia bury her secrets over the last decade. I remembered the exact moment when my father left, the way the tires of his 1998 Mercedes-Benz S-Class had crunched on the gravel, and how Sylvia had turned to me, an 8-year-old girl with a bruised heart, and told me that if I wasn't perfect, I would be next. For 24 years, I had chased that perfection, thinking that if I became a surgeon, if I worked 80-hour weeks for the marginalized, if I married a man of Julian's stature, I would finally be enough to earn a place at her table. But as the wind howled outside, shaking the very foundations of the shelter, I understood that the table was rigged, and the only way to win was to flip it over and expose the rot beneath the white quartz. I thought about Chloe's zero-balance Amex Black Card and her $4.2 million Arcadia estate, and I calculated the exact cost of her silence during the Sunday morning betrayal. She had stood there slicing a $6 grapefruit while our mother planned to destroy my life, her complicity bought and paid for by a trust fund that was built on the disenfranchisement of her own sister. My mind moved with the precision of a scalpel, dissecting the power dynamics of the Montgomery family until all that was left was the raw, ugly truth of their greed. I realized that my mother's greatest fear wasn't a scandal or a loss of money. It was the loss of control, the moment when the people she viewed as pawns realized they were actually the ones holding the board. Julian wasn't just a senator with a $12 million legacy. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had chosen to fight it. And Sylvia had fundamentally misunderstood his character by assuming he would value a seat in the Senate over the woman who had walked through the fire with him. I began to draft a new kind of document on my legal pad, a timeline of events that started with the forged medical records and ended with the public exposure of every financial irregularity my mother had ever committed. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to dismantle the entire infrastructure of her life, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the truth. The desert wind outside seemed to grow louder, a wild, untamed force that mirrored the cold clarity settling into my bones, and I felt a sense of peace that was more profound than any comfort my mother's money could have ever bought. I looked at the survival column on my pad, and it was rapidly filling with names of forensic accountants, media contacts who didn't work for Sylvia's fixers, and the legal statutes regarding the forgery of medical documents in the state of Arizona. This wasn't a tantrum or a cry for help. This was a strategic repositioning of my entire existence. I thought about my 2018 Subaru Outback, with its 84,000 miles and its rattling engine, and I realized that it was a symbol of a life I had actually earned, a life that didn't rely on the whims of a narcissistic matriarch. While Chloe was sleeping on $800 cashmere pillows, insulated from the consequences of her choices, I was here in the dark, preparing for a war that would change the trajectory of our family forever. I remembered the way my mother had looked at me in the kitchen, her skin glowing from $3,000 laser treatments, and how she had called me a stain, a word intended to make me feel small and disposable. But a stain is only a problem if you're trying to keep the fabric pristine, and I was no longer interested in maintaining the Montgomery tapestry. I was interested in burning it down to see what was hidden behind the threads. "Love is a feeling," I whispered to the empty room, the words disappearing into the hum of the fluorescent light. "But revenge is a spreadsheet." I spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing names and dates, using my access to certain medical databases and the public records of the Montgomery Foundation to connect the dots that Sylvia thought were invisible. I saw the patterns of her manipulation, the way she used shell companies to move money when her gambling debts in Las Vegas got too high, and the way she used her political influence to silence the staff members who had seen her at her worst. Every entry on my spreadsheet was a nail in the coffin of her reputation, a clinical, documented fact that no amount of Botox or high-priced PR could erase. I felt like an auditor who had finally found the missing millions, a professional whose only job was to report the findings regardless of how much it hurt the CEO. By 4 a.m., the wind had died down to a low moan, and the first hints of a bruised purple light were beginning to bleed over the horizon of the Superstition Mountains. I sat back in my chair, my neck stiff and my eyes burning from the hours of staring at the screen of my phone and the yellow pages of my pad. But the exhaustion was secondary to the surge of adrenaline coursing through me. I had a clear path forward, a sequence of events that would force Sylvia to choose between her public image and her private cruelty. I wasn't the broken girl she had spent 25 years molding. I was a neurosurgeon who knew exactly where to cut to ensure the patient, in this case, the Montgomery legacy, could never recover. I thought about the kids in the shelter, the ones who had nothing but the clothes on their backs and the resilience in their hearts, and I realized that they had taught me more about survival than my mother ever could. They didn't have $12 million legacies or Arcadia estates, but they knew the value of a person who stayed, the value of a truth that couldn't be bought. I was doing this for them as much as for myself, to show that the people who think they own the world are often the ones who are the most bankrupt inside. I stood up, stretching my limbs until my joints popped, and I walked to the small window of my office. The parking lot was empty, save for my dusty Subaru, and the desert looked vast and indifferent to the dramas of human greed. Sylvia Montgomery had given me 48 hours to disappear, to leave the man I loved and return to the shadows she had assigned to me, but she had forgotten that I was the one who knew how to navigate the darkest parts of the human mind. I wasn't going to spend those hours crying or begging for mercy. I was going to spend them finalizing the data entries on my spreadsheet of retribution. I picked up my phone and sent a single text to Julian, who I knew would be awake in D.C., preparing for his own battles on the Senate floor. The text contained only the photo of the email and 3 words: "Audit begins now." I felt a cold, sharp thrill as I hit send, knowing that the digital signal was traveling across the country, carrying with it the end of an era. My mother wanted a public execution, but she was the one who had already provided the evidence for her own conviction. As I walked out of the nonprofit building and toward my car, the morning air was crisp and carried the scent of creosote and damp earth, a reminder that even in the harshest environments, things can grow and thrive. I drove home through the quiet streets of Phoenix, past the gated communities and the luxury high-rises where people like my mother lived their curated lives, and I felt a sense of freedom that was terrifying in its intensity. I was no longer Emma Montgomery, the complicated daughter who was too broken to be loved. I was the auditor of my own life, and the books were finally going to be balanced. Love might be the thing that keeps you warm at night, but a well-constructed spreadsheet is the thing that sets you free. And as I pulled into my driveway, I knew that by the time the sun fully rose over the valley, the world would finally know the cost of being a Montgomery. The loyalty column was empty, but the survival column was overflowing, and for the first time in 32 years, that was more than enough for me. When the 48-hour countdown began, Julian didn't suggest we consult a therapist to process the trauma of my mother's betrayal, nor did he suggest we retreat into a defensive silence to wait for the storm to pass. Instead, he made a single, decisive phone call to Marcus Thorne, a $900 an hour private investigator and former federal prosecutor who specialized in the kind of high-stakes corporate and political forensics that make the powerful tremble in their custom-made boots. We met in the sanctuary of Julian's private study, a room that felt like a fortress of intellect and silver screen masculinity, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves filled with thousands of leather-bound books and the rich, dark scent of double-shot espresso being pulled from a $4,000 La Marzocco machine. Marcus Thorne sat across from us, a man with eyes like polished flint and a tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire medical school tuition. And he didn't waste a single second on platitudes or comforting words as he opened his encrypted laptop to begin the systematic dismantling of the Montgomery facade. We spent the next 36 grueling hours submerged in a sea of digital data and physical paper trails, constructing what Marcus clinically referred to as the arsenal, a collection of evidence so damning and so precise that it would act as a heat-seeking missile directed straight at the heart of my mother's social and financial standing. The first significant piece of the arsenal was a series of forensic bank statements that Julian had tracked through a labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell companies, revealing that Sylvia had systematically embezzled exactly $412,000 from the Montgomery family trust over the last 18 months. This wasn't just a casual misappropriation of funds. It was a desperate surgical extraction used to cover my sister Chloe's secret and astronomical gambling debts at the Wynn Las Vegas. A mountain of losses accumulated during what she had told the family were simple spa weekends and shopping trips. I sat there in the dim light of the study, watching the spreadsheets scroll past, seeing the exact dates when my mother had moved money meant for my future and the future of the family's charitable endeavors to pay off a casino's credit line so that Chloe wouldn't have to face the consequences of her own addiction. While they were planning to label me a narcotics addict to destroy my reputation, they were actively committing a felony to hide the fact that the golden daughter was a high-stakes degenerate who had bled the family dry in the private VIP rooms of the Las Vegas Strip. Marcus Thorne's fingers moved over the keyboard with the rhythmic precision of a concert pianist, pulling up a sworn and notarized affidavit from the director of the exclusive Sedona Wellness Clinic, a document that felt like a shield of pure, unadulterated truth in the face of my mother's lies. The affidavit confirmed with clinical absolute certainty that my 30-day stay at the facility 2 years ago was for the treatment of severe clinical depression and burnout, a direct result of the 80-hour work weeks I was pulling at the hospital and the relentless psychological pressure applied by Sylvia, and that every single toxicology screen performed during my stay had returned a clean, negative result for any illicit substances. We had the metadata from the forged medical files Sylvia intended to release, the digital timestamps that proved they had been created and edited on a computer in her Paradise Valley estate just 3 days ago, and the paper trail of the communications she had sent to the media fixer in Washington, D.C. Everything was organized into a heavy navy blue leather folder that sat on the center of the mahogany desk, a physical manifestation of the truth that felt heavier and more significant than any sum of money my mother could ever leverage against us. I looked at Julian, whose face was illuminated by the soft glow of a green-shaded banker's lamp, and I saw a man who had completely shifted from the role of a supportive husband to the role of a commander-in-chief preparing for a total war. He didn't care about the $12 million legacy or the potential loss of his Senate seat. He cared about the fact that the woman he loved had been targeted by a predator who shared her DNA, and he was ready to ensure that the fallout from this conflict would be felt for generations. Marcus Thorne took a sip of his black espresso. His expression remains utterly professional, and he noted that in his 20 years of prosecuting federal crimes, he had rarely seen a case of familial betrayal as documented and as legally actionable as the one we were currently holding in our hands. The room was silent, except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paper as I turned the pages of the bank statements, seeing the hundreds of thousands of dollars that had been funneled into the Wynn's accounts while I was struggling to find $6,000 for a new water heater at the foster youth shelter. The injustice of it was a physical ache in my chest, a reminder that the Montgomery name wasn't a mark of honor, but a brand of ownership that Sylvia used to reward those who obeyed her and punish those who dared to find their own path. We had the wire transfer receipts, the recorded phone calls between Sylvia's office and the casino's host, and the signature of the media fixer on a retainer agreement that specifically mentioned the dissemination of the forged records. As the sun began to rise over the Arizona desert, casting long orange fingers of light through the slats of the study's shutters, I realized that we weren't just defending my name, we were preparing to execute a complete and total audit of my mother's soul. Every dollar she had stolen, every lie she had manufactured, and every ounce of trauma she had inflicted on me since I was a child was now condensed into a series of exhibits that were ready to be presented to the world. Marcus Thorne closed his laptop with a sharp, final click and stood up, smoothing the front of his vest and looking at us with a cold, predatory smile that mirrored the one I had seen on my mother's face just 48 hours prior. He told us that the arsenal was complete, that the legal foundations were reinforced, and that whenever we were ready to pull the trigger, he would be the one to ensure the shot was fatal to my mother's social and legal existence. Julian reached out and took my hand, his palm warm and steady against mine, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was part of a team that couldn't be broken by the whims of a narcissistic matriarch. I thought about Chloe, probably waking up in her $4.2 million Arcadia estate, completely unaware that the safety net my mother had woven for her was about to be incinerated by the very sister she had helped to betray. The 36 hours we had spent in that room had transformed me from a woman who was afraid of her own history into a woman who was proud to be the one to finally close the books on the Montgomery lies. We had the paper trail, we had the metadata, and we had the unwavering support of a man who knew exactly how to navigate the darkest corners of the legal system to find justice. As I looked at the heavy Navy folder, I realized that Sylvia's 48-hour ultimatum was the biggest mistake of her life, because it gave us exactly enough time to gather the stones we needed to bring her entire glass house crashing down around her. The scent of the espresso was now mixed with the smell of the morning air, a fresh, clean scent that felt like a new beginning. And as I leaned my head against Julian's shoulder, I knew that the next time we saw my mother, it would not be as her victims, but as her judges. This was no longer about a forged medical file or a political scandal. This was about the absolute and total reclamation of my life from the people who thought they could buy my silence with a trust fund I never wanted. The arsenal was locked and loaded, the forensic prosecutor was on retainer, and the truth was about to become the most expensive thing my mother and sister had ever encountered. I thought about the kids at the shelter, the ones who had been told they were worthless by the people who were supposed to protect them, and I felt a surge of fierce, protective pride that I was finally standing up for the child I used to be. The Montgomery legacy was about to be scorched clean, and as Marcus Thorne tucked the Navy folder under his arm and prepared to leave, I knew that the era of being too complicated to be loved was officially over. We were ready for the public execution, but it wouldn't be mine. It would be a systematic, legal, and social dismantling of a woman who thought she could destroy a life she had never bothered to understand. The clock was still ticking, but for the first time the seconds weren't counting down to my destruction. They were counting down to my liberation. The evening of what my mother intended to be her final victory was framed by the deceptive serenity of a desert twilight, the sky over Scottsdale turning a bruised shade of violet and gold as the temperature settled into a perfect, climate-controlled 72 degrees. Sylvia's mansion, a sprawling 22,000-square-foot fortress of limestone and glass nestled in the most exclusive pocket of Silverleaf, was glowing like a malevolent jewel, illuminated by tens of thousands of dollars in custom architectural lighting. There were 42 high-profile guests in attendance, a curated collection of the state's most powerful lobbyists, judicial heavyweights, and old money dynasty heirs who moved through the grand courtyard with the practiced ease of people who have never known the indignity of a budget. The catering alone had cost a staggering $8,000 for the evening, featuring a menu of Wagyu beef tartare served on Himalayan salt blocks and poached lobster tail infused with saffron and white truffle oil, all prepared by a private chef who usually only works for professional athletes and tech moguls. Sylvia was the undisputed center of gravity in the room, wearing a $6,000 ivory Oscar de la Renta wool crepe suit that made her look like a high priestess of political virtue, her posture regal as she held court near the infinity edge pool. She was waiting for the moment when I would step onto the stage she had built for me and deliver my public resignation from my nonprofit, my marriage, and my life, a ritualistic sacrifice designed to preserve the Montgomery name at the expense of my soul. Julian and I arrived at exactly 8:05 p.m., our black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country pulling into the circular driveway with a low, authoritative rumble that seemed to momentarily quiet the ambient chatter of the cocktail hour. As the valet took the keys, I caught a glimpse of myself in the darkened glass of the foyer doors and realized that I didn't look like the fragile, broken daughter my mother had spent 25 years trying to manufacture. I had bypassed the delicate silk gowns she usually forced me into, opting instead for a $1,200 power suit in a sharp, intimidating shade of navy that matched the heavy leather folder I gripped in my left hand like a medieval shield. The scent of blooming night jasmine and expensive charcoal-filtered air greeted us as we stepped into the house, and I could feel the collective gaze of 42 people shifting toward us, their conversations tapering off into expectant, jagged whispers. Sylvia didn't move toward us immediately. She stayed where she was, silhouetted against the flickering flames of a custom-built linear fire pit, a glass of her favorite $140 Veuve Clicquot in her hand, and a look of thinly veiled triumph etched into her surgically tightened features. She expected a white flag, a woman crushed by the weight of forged medical records and the threat of total social exile. But she had failed to account for the fact that a surgeon knows better than anyone how to remain calm while the world is bleeding out. We moved through the crowd with a deliberate, synchronized pace, Julian's hand resting firmly on my lower back, his presence a stabilizing force that felt more powerful than any trust fund or political endorsement. The room went deathly quiet as we approached the head of the long mahogany dining table, a massive 20-foot piece of furniture that had been set with heirloom silver and $500 crystal stemware for a dinner that was supposed to toast my departure. I could see my sister Chloe standing near the bar, her $4.2 million Arcadia lifestyle reflected in the shimmering sequins of her dress, her eyes darting nervously between Sylvia and me as she sensed a shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. She was clutching her glass so tightly that her knuckles were white, likely remembering the Sunday morning in her $350,000 kitchen when she chose to slice a grapefruit instead of standing up for her sister. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the distant, rhythmic splashing of the pool's fountain and the faint hum of the high-end sound system playing a classical track that felt increasingly like a funeral march for the Montgomery reputation. Sylvia finally broke her pose, taking a slow, graceful step toward me, her ivory suit catching the light from the three-tiered Swarovski chandeliers that hung above us like frozen rain. "Emma, darling, you're just in time," she said, her voice a masterclass in performative maternal concern that sent a chill down my spine, though I didn't allow a single muscle in my face to twitch. She looked at the navy folder in my hand, her eyes flickering with a moment of curiosity that quickly curdled into a cold, dismissive smirk because she assumed it was my signed confession and the legal documents for the divorce she had demanded. She had spent the last 48 hours convinced that her $412,000 embezzlement and her secret payments to a media fixer in D.C. were buried under layers of corporate jargon and social standing. She didn't know that Julian had hired Marcus Thorne, or that we had spent 36 hours in a library smelling of espresso and old paper, constructing an arsenal of truth that would render her ivory suit a shroud by the end of the night. I stood at the head of the table, my shadow stretching across the expensive linen runner, and I looked at the faces of the people who had spent decades enabling my mother's cruelty because it was more convenient than seeking the truth. These were the people who had watched her treat me like a complication, a stain, and a liability, and they were the ones she had invited to witness my public execution. I felt the weight of the 12-megapixel photo on my phone and the sworn affidavits tucked inside the leather folder, and for the first time in 32 years, I didn't feel the need to ask for her permission to speak. The air in the room was thick with the smell of the $8,000 catering, rosemary, garlic, and the metallic tang of chilled seafood, but all I could focus on was the sound of my own heart, steady and rhythmic, a survivalist's drumbeat in the middle of a war zone. Sylvia reached out as if to touch my arm, a gesture meant to signal to the guests that she was the benevolent matriarch guiding her wayward daughter home. But I stepped back with a precision that was clinical. The movement was small, but in the context of our family's history, it was an earthquake, a public rejection of her authority that caused a ripple of audible gasps from the socialites gathered around the perimeter of the room. Julian stepped forward, his charcoal Brioni suit making him look like a man who was already sitting in the highest office in the land. And he looked at my mother with a level of disdain that no amount of political grooming could hide. Sylvia's smile began to falter, the fine lines around her eyes deepening as she realized that the script she had written for this evening was being burned in real time before her very eyes. She looked at the reporter from the local political rag who was standing by the door, the same one she had fed the forged addiction story to, and I saw the first flicker of genuine, unadulterated panic cross her face. She had expected me to be the one on the defensive, pleading for my reputation, but as I laid the heavy navy folder down on the mahogany table, the sound of the leather hitting the wood echoed through the ballroom like a gavel in a courtroom. I thought about the 2018 Subaru Outback parked in my driveway, a car with 84,000 miles that I had paid for with my own sweat and long shifts at the hospital, and I realized that my mother's wealth was nothing but a gilded cage that I was finally unlocking. This victory dinner was a farce, a celebration of a win that had never happened, and the 42 guests were about to become the jury for a trial Sylvia never saw coming. I looked her directly in the eyes, ignoring the 3-carat diamond pendant that glittered at her throat, and I felt the power of the truth rising up within me like a flood tide. She had called me a stain on the legacy, but she was the one who had bled the family trust dry to cover Chloe's gambling debts at the Wynn, and she was the one who had forged medical records to destroy a marriage built on genuine love. The contrast between her ivory suit and the dark secrets she was hiding was about to be laid bare for everyone in Scottsdale to see, and I knew that by the time the sun rose over the desert tomorrow, the Montgomery name would never be the same again. The room remained trapped in that heavy, suffocating silence as I prepared to open the folder, my fingers steady as I flipped the first page to reveal the bank statements showing the exact $412,000 deficit she had created. This wasn't about revenge. It was about the final, absolute audit of a woman who had spent my entire life trying to convince me I was worthless so that she could feel powerful. I looked at the $1,200 ice sculpture nearby, which was weeping onto the floor just as it had at the Biltmore, and I realized that everything in this world was melting away, leaving only the cold, hard reality of what we had discovered in the dark. My name is Emma Montgomery. I am 32 years old, and tonight, I am not the daughter who is too complicated to be loved. I am the woman who is finally telling the truth, and my mother's victory dinner is about to become the scene of her greatest and most public defeat. I took a deep breath, the scent of the desert night air finally reaching me through the open glass doors, and I began to speak, my voice clear and unwavering, cutting through the stagnant atmosphere of the ballroom like a surgeon's blade. I didn't start with a plea or an apology. I started with the facts, the numbers, and the dates, turning the social event into a deposition that no one could escape. Sylvia stood frozen, her glass of Veuve Clicquot trembling slightly in her hand, as she realized that the 48 hours she had given me weren't used to pack my bags, but to build a gallows for her own reputation. The high-profile guests leaned in, their eyes wide with the voyeuristic hunger of the elite, as I began to read from the arsenal, dismantling the Montgomery myth, piece by piece, until all that was left was the sound of the truth echoing off the limestone walls. This was the moment the world shifted, The moment the golden daughter and the narcissistic matriarch were replaced by the forensic reality of their own greed. And as I looked at Julian, I knew that we had already won the only war that mattered. The atmosphere in the grand dining room of my mother's Scottsdale mansion, usually a vacuum of rehearsed smiles and calculated silences, suddenly felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out by a physical force as Julian stepped forward and reached for the wireless microphone sitting on the mahogany sideboard. The 20-foot vaulted ceilings, adorned with hand-painted gold leaf and recessed LED lighting that cost more than a high-end luxury vehicle, acted as a natural amplifier, catching his voice and reflecting it back onto the 42 guests with a clarity that made every syllable feel like a physical weight. "I want to thank my mother-in-law for teaching me the true meaning of transparency," Julian said, his tone devoid of any theatrical anger or shaking resentment, instead possessing the terrifying, leveled calm of a man who had already won the war and was now simply overseeing the surrender. He didn't yell or exert himself to be heard over the ambient hum of the $8,000 catering service. He simply stood there in his charcoal Brioni suit, the light catching the silver at his temples, and began a slow, methodical walk around the perimeter of the table, while handing out 42 identical copies of the navy leather folder we had spent 36 hours curating in the dark. The physical sound of those folders hitting the expensive linen placemats was like a series of muffled gunshots, and as the guests, men who controlled the state's legislative agendas and women who dictated the social hierarchy of Paradise Valley, began to flip through the heavy, high-bond paper, the silence in the room became absolute. Inside, you will find the real medical records from the Sedona Clinic, not the digital fabrications sent to certain members of the press 3 days ago, Julian continued, his footsteps echoing on the white oak floors as he passed the seat where a prominent state judge sat frozen with a piece of Wagyu beef halfway to his mouth. On page 4, you will also find the forensic wire transfer records documenting Sylvia's $412,000 embezzlement from the Montgomery Family Foundation, funds that were diverted through a shell corporation to cover my sister-in-law Chloe's $85,000 baccarat debt at the Wynn Las Vegas last quarter. The sound that followed was one I will never forget, a cacophony of 40 silver forks hitting porcelain plates simultaneously, a deafening metallic crash that signaled the total and irreversible collapse of the Montgomery facade. I watched my mother, Sylvia, as the color drained from her face with a speed that made her expensive $3,000 laser treatments and high-end fillers look like a cracked porcelain mask, her skin turning the grayish, lifeless color of wet ash under the glare of the Swarovski chandeliers. She was still holding her crystal flute of $140 Veuve Clicquot, but her hand was shaking so violently that the pale gold liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the ivory wool crepe of her $6,000 Oscar de la Renta suit with a dark, spreading blotch of failure. Beside her, Chloe began to hyperventilate, the rhythmic, wet gasps of her panic cutting through the stunned silence of the room as she clutched her $12,000 black Epsom leather Birkin bag to her chest, as if the expensive accessory could somehow shield her from the evidence of her own greed. The guests, people who had been Sylvia's closest confidants and allies for decades, didn't offer a word of support or a hand of comfort. Instead, with the predatory instinct of the elite, they began pulling out their titanium-cased iPhones to film the meltdown, the glow of 40 screens illuminating the room like a digital firing squad. The scent of the rosemary-infused lamb and the saffron-poached lobster suddenly felt nauseating, a reminder of the excess that had been bought with stolen money and maintained through the systematic emotional destruction of a daughter who was deemed a liability. I stood at the head of the table, my hands resting on the back of a hand-carved mahogany chair, and I felt a sense of clarity that was almost transcendental, watching the woman who had called me a stain become the very thing she feared most, a public scandal. Sylvia tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound came out other than a dry, clicking noise as her carefully curated world disintegrated in real time before the very people she had tried to impress. The metadata on the forged files, the timestamps on the bank transfers, and the sworn affidavits from the clinic were circulating through the room like a virus, each guest leaning over to their neighbor to point out a specific line of evidence, their whispers rising into a low, buzzing roar of judgment. I looked at Chloe, whose eyes were wide and glazed with the realization that the zero balance on her Amex Black Card was no longer a secret, and that the $4.2 million Arcadia estate she lived in was built on the wreckage of our family's integrity. She looked smaller in that moment, stripped of the social protection my mother's money provided, a 30-year-old socialite who had never learned how to exist without a trust fund or a manufactured reputation to hide behind. Julian returned to my side, his task completed with a surgical precision that left no room for a counterattack, and he placed his hand over mine, his touch the only thing in the room that felt real or grounded in something other than malice. This wasn't just a political maneuver for him. It was an act of reclamation for the woman he had married, a woman who had been told she was too complicated to be loved by a mother who was currently being exposed as a common thief in front of her own inner circle. The high-profile guests, realizing that the Montgomery ship was not just sinking, but being actively torpedoed, began to stand up one by one, their chairs scraping against the floor with a harsh, jarring sound that punctuated the end of the evening. They didn't wait for the dessert course or the formal resignation they had been promised. They moved toward the foyer with the practiced haste of people who knew when a legacy had become toxic, their faces reflected in the massive hallway mirrors as they hurried away from the fallout. Sylvia remained seated, a solitary figure in ivory wool surrounded by the remnants of an $8,000 dinner and 42 Navy folders that contained the obituary of her social life. She looked up at me, and for the first time in 32 years, I didn't see a matriarch or a predator. I saw a frightened, aging woman who had traded everything of value for a collection of status symbols and a feeling of control that had vanished in less than 10 minutes. The air in the ballroom began to circulate again as the massive glass doors were opened by the fleeing guests, bringing in the cool night scent of creosote and desert dust, a smell that felt infinitely cleaner than the atmosphere of the mansion. I thought about the 2018 Subaru Outback waiting for me, a car that represented a life of genuine work and honest struggle, and I realized that I would never have to set foot in this house again or answer to the woman who lived within its limestone walls. The public execution Sylvia had planned for me had been turned back upon her with a mathematical certainty, leaving her to face the legal and social consequences of a lifetime of manipulation. As the last of the guests vanished into the night, their car engines humming in the driveway as they rushed to call their own PR teams and lawyers, the room fell into a heavy, ringing silence. Julian leaned in and whispered that it was time to go, his voice a gentle contrast to the cold authority he had used to dismantle my mother's life. And I nodded, my fingers finally letting go of the mahogany chair. I walked past Chloe, who was now sobbing into the silk of her dress, her Birkin bag forgotten on the floor, and I didn't feel a single pang of guilt or a desire to offer her comfort, because the comfort she had enjoyed for years was a debt I had been forced to pay. I walked past my mother, who was staring at the $1,200 ice sculpture as it slowly melted into a puddle of tap water on the floor, its intricate carvings disappearing until it was nothing more than a shapeless, weeping block of ice. I didn't say goodbye, and I didn't look back as we moved through the foyer and out into the 72-degree evening, the desert wind blowing through my hair and carrying away the scent of $300 Chanel No. 5. My name is Emma Montgomery. I am 32 years old, and as we climbed into the black Tahoe and drove away from the Silverleaf estate, I realized that I was no longer a complicated daughter or a toxic asset on someone else's balance sheet. I was a woman who had survived a war, a surgeon who had removed a malignant growth from her own history, and a wife who was loved by a man who didn't care about legacies or trust funds. The forks had hit the porcelain, the iPhones had recorded the truth, and the Montgomery name had been scorched clean by the very fire Sylvia had tried to use to consume me. We drove toward the lights of Phoenix, the city sprawling out before us like a map of a future I was finally free to choose. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was without needing a folder or a spreadsheet to prove it. Family is not the people who forge your records to keep you in line. Family is the person who hands out the truth and stays by your side while the world watches it burn. The audit was over, the books were closed, and as the desert night swallowed the silhouette of the mansion in the rearview mirror, I felt the heavy weight of 25 years of lies finally, permanently, lift from my shoulders. The aftermath of that night at the Silverleaf Mansion was not a cinematic explosion of emotion, but rather a clinical, cold, and systematic dismantling of the world Sylvia Montgomery had spent 4 decades constructing with stolen bricks. By exactly 9 a.m. the following morning, the Arizona Superior Court had issued an emergency injunction based on the evidence Marcus Thorne and Julian had presented, and the Montgomery Family Trust, that multi-million-dollar reservoir of power and control, was frozen solid, leaving my mother and sister effectively locked out of the very fortress they had used to exclude me. Sylvia is currently navigating the grim reality of a high-stakes civil lawsuit for the embezzlement of $412,000 from the family foundation, a legal battle that is draining her remaining personal liquid assets at an alarming rate, and she is also facing a $2.5 million defamation claim that Julian and I filed to ensure the record of my professional integrity is legally and permanently restored. The woman who once moved through the world in $6,000 Oscar de la Renta suits is now spending her afternoons in a mahogany-paneled deposition room answering pointed questions from federal prosecutors about her offshore wire transfers and her attempts to manufacture medical records. The fall of the golden child was even more precipitous, as Chloe was forced to list her $4.2 million Arcadia estate for sale just 3 weeks after the victory dinner to cover her mounting baccarat debts and the legal fees associated with the trust's investigation. She went from a life of zero-balance Amex Black cards and $1,200 a month Botox habits to living in a 750-square-foot rental apartment in a nondescript complex in Mesa, where the view from her window is a sun-bleached parking lot instead of the majestic peaks of Camelback Mountain. I am told she had to sell her $12,000 Birkin bags and her $2,000 Loro Piana throw pillows just to make the security deposit on her new, cramped reality, a transformation that must feel like a slow-motion car crash for someone who has never known the value of a single dollar she actually earned. I haven't spoken to either of them in exactly 142 days, a silence that is not heavy or grieving, but rather a profound and necessary peace that has allowed the phantom ringing of their constant criticism to finally fade from my ears. I live now in a house filled with a type of silence I never knew existed during my 32 years as a Montgomery. A silence that is not a precursor to an argument or a void to be filled with lies, but a warm, steady atmosphere of genuine safety. Julian and I have moved into a modest but beautiful home in the historic district of Phoenix, a place with thick plaster walls and original hardwood floors that doesn't smell of $300 Chanel No. 5, but of fresh eucalyptus and the expensive espresso we brew ourselves every morning. He is still the senator from Arizona, but the $12 million legacy my mother tried to weaponize has been replaced by a reputation for unshakable ethics. And he looks at me every single day with a depth of respect that has nothing to do with my family name and everything to do with the woman who stood her ground when the world was on fire. He knows, with a certainty that requires no spreadsheets or audits, that my worth was never a political calculation or a complication to be managed, but the very foundation of the life we are building together on our own terms. There is a specific kind of liberation that comes from finally realizing that family is not a biological mandate, but a moral choice, and that blood is often far thinner than the truth when the pressure of survival is applied. I still drive my 2018 Subaru Outback, though the odometer now reads 86,000 miles, and the rattle in the engine has been fixed by a mechanic I paid with money from my own salary as a pediatric neurosurgeon. The foster youth shelter where I work has finally received the $6,000 industrial water heater it needed, funded not by a reluctant grant from the Montgomery Foundation, but by a private donation Julian and I made from our own savings, ensuring those children have the warmth and dignity they deserve. When I walk through the halls of Phoenix Children's Hospital now, I don't feel like a stain or a liability. I feel like a woman who has performed the most difficult surgery of her career on her own life, successfully resecting the toxicity that was threatening to consume her entire future. I think back to that 1:45 a.m. night in my office when I drew the line on the yellow legal pad and realized the loyalty column was empty, and I feel a surge of gratitude for the cold clarity of that moment. If I hadn't stopped being a victim and started being an auditor, I would still be trapped in that Arcadia sunroom, begging for the crumbs of my mother's approval while she planned my public execution over a $6 organic grapefruit. Revenge may have started as a spreadsheet, but it ended as a reclamation, a way to balance the books after 25 years of emotional and financial deficit that I was never meant to repay. The 42 high-profile guests who filmed the meltdown on their iPhones have long since moved on to the next scandal, but the record of Sylvia and Chloe's betrayal remains a permanent digital footprint, a reminder that the elite are only as strong as the secrets they can afford to keep. The 72-degree evenings in Scottsdale still happen, the desert sky still turns that bruised shade of violet and gold, but I no longer feel the need to hide in the shadows of someone else's limestone mansion. My name is Emma Montgomery, and for the first time in my life, that name belongs entirely to me, untethered from the forged records and the embezzled funds and the psychological warfare of a woman who didn't know how to love what she couldn't control. I have learned that family isn't the people who share your DNA while they plot your downfall. Family is the person who hands out the Navy folders of truth and stays to help you clean up the wreckage when the storm has passed. I have found my peace in the quiet corners of my new home, in the steady hands of my husband, and in the faces of the children I heal every day. Children who know that a person's value isn't determined by a trust fund, but by the courage it takes to stand up and speak when the rest of the room is silent. As I sit on my porch and watch the moon rise over the Superstition Mountains, I realize that the 142 days of silence have been the most honest days of my life. A period of profound growth that no laser treatment or high-end plastic surgery could ever replicate. Sylvia and Chloe are now just names on a legal document, ghosts of a past that has no power over my present, and while their world continues to shrink into smaller rentals and more frequent depositions, mine is expanding in ways I never thought possible. The Montgomery legacy is finally being written by someone who values the truth over appearances, and as I close my eyes and breathe in the scent of the desert rain, I know that the audit is complete, the books are closed, and I am finally, completely free. The $1,200 ice sculpture has long since melted. Its water evaporated into the dry Arizona air, leaving no trace of the family crest it once carried, and in its place, I have built something that won't disappear when the lights go down. I am no longer the complicated daughter. I am the architect of my own destiny, and the silence in my house is not an absence of sound, but a presence of peace that I earned with every single word of the truth. My life is no longer a performance for 42 guests at a Wagyu beef dinner. It is a real, gritty, beautiful existence that I share with a man who knows my worth is immeasurable. The public execution Sylvia planned ended up being her own, and as I look at the stars, I feel a quiet, enduring triumph that no amount of money could ever buy. The triumph of a woman who finally looked the monster in the eye and realized she was the one who held the power all along. The story of the Montgomerys is no longer a tragedy of betrayal, but a testament to the fact that when you bury someone who knows how to survive, you are only giving them the ground they need to grow into something you can no longer touch. My name is Emma, and I am finally home.